Welcome, everyone. I'm Grzymala-Busse. I'm director of the Europe Center here at Stanford. And today we have two experts on the post-communist state and its various pathologies, giving a talk about their new book. And so first, Bálint Magyar is a political economist and the author of the famous post-communist mafia state, quite possibly the sharpest analysis of the self-serving and tangled processes of state building in post-communist Europe. He's also an observer of politics from the inside, first as an anti-communist dissident, and then as a member of parliament and the Hungarian Minister of Education in the 1996-8 and 2002-6 governments. Bálint Madlovics, his co-author, is a political scientist, economist, and sociologist at the Central European University. And he's an expert on post-communist politics, both in scholarly, and has published extensively both in scholarly publications and in popular news outlets, including Project Syndicate. And today we're honored and delighted to welcome them as they present their book, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes. So welcome, Bálint and Bálint.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bálint will start the presentation.
All right. Let me share the slides. I hope you can. And all right. So thank you very much for this introduction. And it's a great honor for us to be here. And let me see if I can give just a brief overview of the main ideas and points that we make in this huge volume, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes. Now, the subtitle of our talk is A Challenge to the Mainstream Comparative Approach. And just as an introduction, let me say a few words about what this mainstream comparative approach is. Now, if you think back to the 1990s, there was an illusion prevailing in political science, and that was the illusion of linear progress towards liberal democracy, that any regime can be built on any kind of ruins of communist dictatorships. So basically the idea was that here are a bunch of countries that have just abandoned communism. And of course, their systems at the moment are not perfect democracies or perfect free market economies, but they are going to be. They are now on the right track. And of course, they have some problems, but these are just teething problems. These are just problems to be surmounted, and eventually they are going to become more or less like Western liberal democracies. And hence, we are approaching the end of history. Now, this was a narrative, and this was an idea that political scientists in a decade or so realized they might reject. And they, in a decade around the turn of the millennium, came to the conclusion that this narrative of transitional systems might be needed to be replaced by a narrative of terminal stations. So stations, where regimes are show no more progress toward liberal democracy. And that was the point when in the literature, transitology, which was the branch of political science dealing with the transition, was replaced by what we call hybridology. And hybridology is the idea that there is a democracy dictatorship axis with two polar opposites, liberal democracy and the classical overtly oppressive dictatorship. And between these two polar opposites, there is a huge gray zone, a huge area of intermediary hybrid regimes, including electoral democracy, competitive authoritarianism, hegemonic authoritarianism, and there are many other labels we can also mention, like illiberal democracy or defective democracy, and other kinds of labels. And basically, this is how this hybridology, which is now mainstream in political science and in comparative regime theory, is trying to conceptualize these regimes and also to place them on this democracy dictatorship axis. Now, what's the problem with this? Why are we challenging this mainstream? Now, if I have to summarize it in one sentence, that would be this. The regime labels have been changed, but the regime framework has not. So the new regime labels have been introduced, and it has been realized that these regimes are no longer going toward the goal of liberal democracy, but essentially when when hybridologists start talking about the details of these regimes, they generally and essentially still treat these regimes as if they were almost like Western regimes. And the first and most important point of this is that the separation of spheres of social action, political, economic, and communal, are presumed to be separated. So when hybridologists talk about governments, parties, politicians, then they are trying to define, and they talk about these with respect to hybrid regimes, of course, not just liberal democracies, yet they are using these terms familiar from Western terminology used for the Western regimes, and they try to define, or they are actually defining, a political sphere with this government and institutions and whatever, political sphere with political actors who have political motives. They try to get power and votes, get re-elected and whatever. On the other hand, they talk about an independent or a separated economic sphere with economic actors who have economic motives like profitability and getting favorable regulations and whatever. And of course, these two can cooperate with each other, but the political actors are interested in political motives and the economic actors are in economic motives. The main idea of the whole cooperation of them is to strengthen their elite positions in their own sphere of social action. The politician doesn't become an entrepreneur, and the entrepreneur doesn't become a politician. This is what the separation of spheres of social action means. And this is what is presumed in the language used if we use Western terms. And this is, however, the phenomenon that is non-existent, or at least not to the same degree and not as generally as in the Western regimes in post-communist regimes. And this is, and now I'm going to the second point, because you cannot see this. You cannot see this problem if you focus only on the political level and you disregard the stubborn sociological structures connected to this political level. Now, if I move on to the third point, which is about language, I already mentioned the use of Western terminology for describing not the regime labels, but the elements of the regimes. Actually, even the regime labels can be misleading when they present these post-communist systems as if they were deviant forms of liberal democracy. If you think about a term like illiberal democracy, for instance. Now, illiberal democracy, if you say that, and you apply it to a post-communist regime, it's basically as if you went to a zoo, you saw an elephant, and you didn't say it was an elephant. You would say it was an illiberal fish. You would say that, well, basically it's a fish. This huge animal is basically a fish because it's very similar. It has two eyes, it has a mouth, it has a spinal cord, it has internal organs, and it has a skeleton. And so there are many similarities, but it's not really like a fish because it's a bit defective. It's a bit illiberal because it doesn't live in water. It has this long funny nose, and it doesn't have fins and gills. So it's a defective illiberal fish. Now, already from this metaphor, you can see that applying this kind of idea of or calling a post-communist system some kind of defective form of democracy is actually saying as if these two regimes had the same internal kind of logic, the same internal kind of structure, whereas in fact, like an elephant and the fish, they are not related, and they are not. They show completely different kind of internal function. So, and this is where I get to the fourth point, that the explicit teleology of transitology, which meant that transitologists actually said it explicitly out loud that these regimes were going toward liberal democracy, that is replaced by the implicit teleology of hybridology. They no longer say this out loud, that these regimes progress toward liberal democracy, but essentially they treat it as if they followed a general Western logic. Now, how do we propose to get out of this? Well, generally, we take the democracy-dictatorship axis. So, and we use János Kornai's three categories of democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship. So we have, and this is the top axis of this, or top side of this triangle. However, we double these categories. So what we do is to expand the democracy-dictatorship axis into a triangle. And just in a few words, with the case of democracy, there is liberal democracy, which is pretty much the well-known Western model with separated spheres of social action and the parties actually interested in parties with political motives and confined to the political sphere competing with each other. Whereas on the other hand, in patronal democracy, what seems to be party competition is in fact not party competition. In fact, in patronal democracy, that's the competition of informal patronal networks, which operate outside the formal institutional realm. They make decisions outside the formal institutional realm, including economy and other realms. And they use parties as camouflage and also to channel their intentions into the formal and legal sphere. So that's a completely different kind of competition. Now, if you move to autocracy, both patronal autocracy as opposed to patronal democracy, where there are multiple networks, and it's a multi-pyramid patronal network, which are competing with each other. In patronal autocracy, there is only one network. If you think about Russia and Hungary, as opposed to Ukraine and Romania with competing networks, in Russia or Hungary, there is one network, and the other networks are either marginalized or they are subjugated to the main network. However, there is another kind of autocracy, which is conservative autocracy, where you do not see such patronal structures. You see a political sphere, which is an autocracy. So it's no longer a democracy regarding the political institutions, but the economy is basically left alone, and no oligarchs and different kind of actors appear. And as for dictatorship, we distinguish the classical communist dictatorship and what we call market exploiting dictatorship, which no longer is totalitarian regarding the economic sphere, but it opens up its economic sphere. And of course, the best example of this is China. Now, how do we place these countries in this triangle, which now tries to incorporate political, economic, and sociological dimensions? And well, this is going to be how. And we can divide this triangle up by different dimensions. Now, this is the first dimension, which is the hybrid regime type. This is the normal political institutional structure, but we can already see that, for instance, if you talk about comparative authoritarianism or hegemonic authoritarianism, that is not a single regime type, but it can mean a whole host of different kinds of regimes. For instance, if you talk about comparative authoritarianism, some of them, going to another dimension, are non-patronal, while others are informal patronal. What I just talked about is competition of patronal networks. Now, in a conservative autocracy, which can be competitive authoritarian, that's a non-patronal system, whereas patronal democracy and autocracy are informal patronal systems. Now, also, it's very much related. What is the ruling party's function in these systems? Now, if we talk about conservative autocracy, for example, or a liberal democracy, in a liberal democracy, there is a government elected, there is a party elected, and that party is actually governing. So in the decisions are made inside the party's formal decision-making bodies. Now, in a patronal autocracy, even though hybridologists very often talk about the United Russia Party, or even more frequently, the Fidesz party in Hungary, which is the ruling party, as they say, in fact, that's not a real governing party. That because the decisions are not made within the formal bodies of the party. The actual decisions are made outside the formal institutional realm, within the informal bodies of the informal patronal network, and the party is only used to transmit the already made decisions to the political realm. Now, if I move on, this is something I already mentioned, that in democracies, and this is the main differentiation between democracies and the other kinds of systems, that in democracies, be it liberal or patronal, they are multi-pyramid systems with different independent power centers competing, whereas in autocracies, there is a single pyramid power network. In the case of patronal autocracy, it's a single pyramid patronal network. Now, the economy, which is also incorporated in this model. Now there are three general types. One is market coordination and private property, which is the general model of liberal democracy, and that remains dominant in patronal democracy and conservative autocracy as well. However, when we go to patronal autocracy, there is relational market redistribution. This is something different from a communist dictatorship, for example, because there, the ruling elite in bureaucratic resource distribution, they determined both the ownership structure and the production structure. Whereas in patronal autocracy, they no longer determine the production structure, but they do determine the ownership structure. They decide who gets to own what, and they take over companies and they give it to loyal oligarchs. And finally, and after this I give word to Bálint, This is a slide about the or the dimension in the triangle about the anatomy of civil society. By civil society, I now mean I use this term very broadly. So basically, we include 4 groups in here, including NGOs, media, independent entrepreneurs, and also the citizens, and whose civil liberties can be respected, because these 4 groups, if their autonomies are intact, and that means they are free, and that means that an opposition to the regime, an independent power center, can grow out, and that is what autocracies try to avoid by subjugating these elements of civil society, by broking these 4 autonomies I mentioned. And that is the key element whether what we have to look at when we want to determine whether a country is already a consolidated autocracy or it's still one that can be changed from the inside by inside forces. And now I'll give the floor to Bálint.
Thank you very much. Bálint already emphasized that when we analyze post-communist regimes, then there is a special character of them which is related to past dependency, that to what degree the different spheres of social actions are separated or not. Therefore, our basic statement that in most of these regimes, informality and patronalism is not just a side effect, not just a deviancy, but a system constituting element of these regimes. And therefore, informality, here you can see the definitions of this. They are not necessarily synonyms with each other, because patronalism can be bureaucratic one, like in classic communist regimes, and can be formal one, like in patronal democracies or in patronal autocracies. But what does it mean really when we are speaking about the patronal character of these regimes, and how the patronalism becomes a system-defining element of these regimes? The first dimension of this, when the formal institutions are transformed into informal ones, and as Bálint already stated, that the decisions are taken out from the formal bodies of parties, governments, etc., and taken into informal bodies, informal groups of people, which consist of persons having formal and informal positions. For example, therefore, the ruling and decision-making elite of let us say of patronal autocracies is called chief patron's court, like synonym from traditional courts from the feudal ages, when the persons being in a small group bringing decisions was just appointed, selected by the chief patron of those societies. The second dimension is when the normative regulations are transformed into discretional regulations. The third element is when the corporate collective authorization is replaced by personal authorizations, and when the bureaucratic institutional chains of command are replaced by clientelist personal chains of commands. In a patronal autocracy, these features are the dominant features and tied to a single pyramid patronal network, while in a patronal democracy, competing patronal networks are with each other, and they do not form a single pyramid patronal network. And in such a way, we are able to detect that what is the what kind of primary trajectories we can detect in post-communist regimes. When we choose post-communist regimes, it was very fruitful situation for us that all of these countries, what we try to compare, they were communist dictatorship before the regime changes, and it created a good opportunity for comparing these societies. So within the primary trajectories, the first type of regime change, which was followed by Estonia, Poland, and Hungary in the 90s. We could see that if we just look at the political structure of these regimes, we can say that communist dictatorships were transformed into liberal democracies. But if we are speaking about the realm of informality and patronage, then we can say that a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network was transformed into a multi-pyramid non-patronal network in these societies. This is the case when these countries became, after the regime change, liberal democracies. The second type is when a communist dictatorship is transformed not into a liberal democracy and the political sphere, but a patronal democracy, which means that a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network is replaced by a multi-pyramid informal patronal network. This was like Romania, Ukraine, and some other countries. Most of the countries belongs to this type. The next type is of the regime changes when from a communist dictatorship directly you go into a patronal autocracy, where a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network is replaced by a single pyramid informal patronal network. This is the case of Kazakhstan, the other Central Asian countries, and with a little, not considering, for example, the Yeltsin period in Russia. Russia happened the same within 12 or 14 years. And the fourth change is what we do not call regime change, but simply a model change, when you remain in the realm of dictatorships, but the dictatorship itself is transformed from a communist dictatorship into a market exploiting dictatorship, where the single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network remains a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network. This is the case of China. But there are, we could say, secondary trajectories as well in this model, when some of these countries did not remain in that place where they were transferred just after the regime changes. This happened, for example, in the case of Poland. This is the first case when from a liberal democracy, it's going towards the direction of conservative autocracy, and from a multi-pyramid non-patronal network is going into the direction of a single pyramid non-patronal network. It means that in a single pyramid non-patronal network, that while they try to monopolize the political power concerning the economic sphere, they do not create, they do not build out a patron-client network as a dominant force in the economy. The next type of secondary trajectories, when from a liberal democracy you are going into the direction of a patronal democracy, like in the case of Czech Republic, when from a multi-pyramid non-patronal network, it's just on the way of transforming into a multi-pyramid informal patronal network. It's not finished yet. But the case, but the fact that the leader of the country now, Babiš, is practically an oligarch as well, who is at the same time the political leader of the country, it shows the collusion of political and economic power, which is the major characteristic of patronal democracies and patronal autocracies as well. The third change, third type of secondary trajectories is the case of Hungary after 1998 and 2010. The process was finished, that when a liberal democracy is transformed into a patronal autocracy, from a multi-pyramid non-patronal network, you reach a position of a single pyramid informal patronal network. For such a transition, it can have three phases: the autocratic attempt, the autocratic breakthrough, and the autocratic consolidation. Hungary is already over of the autocratic consolidation process. This is what's happening now. While, for example, in the case of Poland, there is an autocratic attempt, but the autocratic breakthrough did not happen yet. It has different institutional obstacles and conditions why it was not so easy in Poland like it happened in Hungary. And the fourth secondary trajectory is, for example, in the case of Russia, what let us say it from a patronal democracy, which was not totally that, but let's say that the Yeltsin period was close to that, which was characterized by a original multi-pyramid formal patronal network. It went through a patronal autocracy, a single pyramid informal patronal network. And here you see that what are the two levels of the regime dynamics and cycles in post-communist regimes. Normally, the mainstream analysis and literature is dealing only with democratic transformation and democratic transformations, de-democratization, re-democratization, democratic backsliding. They concentrate mainly on the political institutions. Of course, they speak about the separation of branches of power, and maybe the media is also listed to this sphere, but they are dealing with the formal institutions and the defections in this system. And they practically abandon and they neglect the second level of analysis for whether there is a patronal transformation or anti-patronal transformation in these regimes. And here you can see that from what kind of system you go to another one, that, for example, when from a liberal democracy to a patronal democracy, then the patronal transformation is going on without an autocratic breakthrough. Still, the elements of democracy are working. There is a real competition, but the actors are transformed from purely political actors led by ideologies by patronal actors, which motivation is power and personal wealth. Or when from a liberal democracy there is a patronal autocracy, then you find an autocratic breakthrough with a patronal transformation as well. But when you want to make, let us say, from a patronal autocracy, you can go into a patronal democracy. It means that there is a democratic breakthrough without anti-patronal transformation. And this is, I will show you later on this 3D interactive model, which gives the cyclical character of these regimes. The cyclical character that the color revolutions are coming and repeated several times, but they do not result a transformation into liberal democracies, because even the democratic breakthrough is not accompanied by an anti-patronal transformation in these systems. And now let's try to go to the 3D model. You can see now where the different dimensions, what about Bálint spoke already, you see as separate triangles. This 3D model, you can work with this. Let's go now for the to the top, which is the general scheme of these countries, and let's have a look at it. What are those rules which going on? Let's start with Estonia, for example, and here in this model you can make a move where you can see that what is the route what Estonia went through, while on the right side down you will see also that which is the date from which they remained in the same place. The second trajectory, because until now we spoke as primary and secondary trajectories as ideal times. And now, as a result of country studies, case studies, we try to fill out their real route in this system. Let's take the second type of this trajectory. Here, let us say Romania. What is the way through they are going through? Now I push out the timing that you should see. The third one, let us say, which goes is Kazakhstan, the third model, and here for the first, just a model change is China. And you can, when you are going you want to choose a certain time now, because let's take out the roots, take out from this model. Now we are after 2014, something like around the end of the of this decade. You will see that if we go back, then in the different dimensions, they should be at the same place, and you can have a look at any other part of these dimensions. Let us say to the economic part, which says that at this time Estonia has a competitive market with the dominance of private property. The next case was Romania, with somewhere at the edge of between the dominance of the competitive market and the relational market redistribution, while at the same time, because in the case of Kazakhstan, it's clearly a relation, the economy is dominated by relational market redistribution, and there is no separated power and ownership. There is no power without ownership, and there is no ownership without power. And China is as a market belonging a market exploiting dictatorship. It's a combination of bureaucratic resource redistribution with huge state property and the competitive market at the same time. We can go back these regimes. But now, if let me go back to two examples as I want to finish this this presentation, and we take out China, Kazakhstan, and Estonia from the picture, and let's put Ukraine also here. You will see a move from patronal democracy. It has an inherent instinct that patron-client network, which is elected in a patronal democracy, they are striving to pursuing totalization of power, monopolization of power. Normally, there is two major institutional constraints to fulfill their will on this route. One is the proportionate election system, which does not let to have the monopoly of power of one patron-client network, and the other is the separated divided executive power, where the government and the president, normally the directly elected president, they have both real power. Now, what you can see, especially in the case of Ukraine, where the president has a much bigger power than, for example, in the case of Romania, that there is always a wish to monopolize the political power. Kuchma first, then Yanukovych, then different orange and color revolutions create a re-democratization process. But as this re-democratization process with the people are accompanied with the help of such oligarchs, which were not totally subjugated and forced into a single pyramid patronal network. Therefore, the non-patronal transformation, the anti-patronal transformation could not happen, and it gives a permanent cyclical character of these regime changes, a cyclical dynamic for these changes. When the autocratic breaks through, like in the case of, let us say, Hungary, Hungary is successful, and now I push out Romania and Ukraine, successful, then what happened, especially after 2010, when Orbán seized with half of the votes, 2/3 of the seats in the parliament, and practically a monopoly of political power, the autocratic breakthrough happened, and it was followed by autocratic consolidation as well, as like, let us say, in the case of Russia as well, when in 1898, Putin came into power, but from 2003, he was able to build out the monopoly of his political power. This is one thing what I wanted to show you, and the other is if I took out the root and now I put is a comparison of Poland and Hungary. So if we see only their positions only on the dictatorship democracy axis, then we have a false vision that they are going on the same route of de-democratization. Hungary is already a more autocratic country than Poland, but they are really same type of autocracies if we just concentrate on the political institutions. But in our model, it shows that of course autocracies can have a very different very different types as well. And if we go, let us say, for example, what I already mentioned, the patronalism of rule, you can say that the Polish autocratic attempt is a non-patronal one, the Hungarian one is an informal patronal one. If we go, let us say, to the question of market economy and relational market redistribution, they represent absolutely different types of autocracies. When we are speaking about, let us say, the corruption, then we see that while in Poland the corruption, of course, as a deviancy exists, but it's a system-destroying corruption. In Hungary, in Russia, in Central Asian former Soviet republics, corruption is a system constituting corruption, where the state itself is a criminal state, not just a corrupt state, but a criminal state, and not a captured state, but a criminal state, which means that a political enterprise becomes an economic enterprise and expropriates the states. Well, thank you very much for your attention. This was our presentation, and we are looking for having questions from you as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation and a very sort of rich set of empirical and conceptual findings. We have some questions. I would ask the audience members, if you have any questions, to please put them in the Q&A box, and I'll transmit them to our speakers. But I'm going to abuse my privilege as the moderator and ask first, you did a beautiful job of explaining the different shifts from sort of, one vertex to the other of these sort of triangular regime conceptualizations. But I was wondering if you could talk more about why we see these shifts. Why is it that Poland and Estonia wind up, Estonia winds up in one corner, Hungary winds up in another, and Poland is someplace in the middle, even though previous scholarship just assumed that they had such similar trajectories and they were all sort of bound to go in the same trajectory. So why do we see these different patterns?
This is a question of path dependency as well, which path dependency is not determinant, but of course it influences very much what these countries are going through. And if we are looking at historically what happened in the question of separation of spheres of social actions, politics, economy, and communal actions, then we see that the countries are more Western-type countries. There it was a more finished process, and those who are not, it's even was not stopped and reversed, but even did not happen historically. The communist rule just hid these differences with the same structure of dictatorship, with this monopoly of one-party system, monopoly of state ownership, and and monopoly of power, of course, and with this bureaucratic patronal, single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network. These are different type of civilizations, I would say, which can be described as well. Those countries within the Soviet Empire, not only in the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Empire, which belong to the Western Christianity, there historically this separation of social spheres was much more completed, while those which belong to the Orthodox Christianity, it was not completed and just stopped and went through a regression during the Soviet time. And those who belong to let us say to the Muslim world before, there you could not see this separation of social spheres before. This somehow determines, but not totally, what is the root of these countries. There are two real exceptions. One is Hungary, which normally would be in the field of in the group of the Visegrad 4 countries, you know. But this is what I try to illuminate with the institutional constraints, that Hungary had a very disproportionate election system, with the help of which Orban could reach in 2010 with half of the votes, 2/3 of the seats in the parliament, monopoly of political power, and next time to change the rule of the games in such a way that in 2014 it was enough for him already 44% of the votes to have again 67% of the seats, and then 48% of the votes in 2018 to have again 2/3 of the seats. And the second thing is that we had not the system of a directly elected president who would be a representative of a divided executive power. While, for example, I think that if in Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia would have been such a disproportionate election system and not divided executive power, they would be the same regimes that we are now, and it's not a question of right-wing or left-wing ideologies, because, for example, in Romania or Bulgaria or even Slovakia, any of the right-wing or left-wing parties who could have a monopoly of political power would have gone toward the direction of a so-called mafia state.
There's a question here that sort of asks you to broaden your perspective in a way. And I ask whether, you know, even though it's not a post-communist case, where you would put Trump. And I want to make that into a bigger question, because we see this kind of fusion of political and business spheres with other leaders, right? I mean, whether Ronald Reagan or Silvio Berlusconi or Trump, this is not exclusively a post-communist phenomenon. The idea that, you know, you become a political leader because you're a businessman, or you use your political office to improve your business chances. So how post-communist is this?
Well, I characterized the relation between Orban and or Putin and Trump with the difference that Orban and Putin are mafiosos with a mafia. Trump was a mafioso without a mafia. So the institutional constraints in the United States were much stronger that it could go such a direction. But practically, Trump was the first leader of the country in this century who had his personal business, and he's used his office for enriching himself, diminishing the debts what his ventures had, etc., etc. So we do not think that some characteristics of this description should not be used in other countries, other, let us say, non-democratic countries. But there are some axioms which exist in our model. For example, what we did not open up because it was not necessary. Such an axiom, for example, that the former political actors are parties. But for example, in Iran, not definitely parties, it's a theocracy. or in other places, or another axiom what we did not give up, that the state could operate as a state. So it was not a failed state. The question is simply that in whose favor the state is operating, and not that whether it's viable and can work as a state. This is why we speak about different kind of states, but it's not the question whether it's a failed state or not. I think, for example, Russia was the closest to this position, to be a failed state in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm. Christoph makes a similar point. So what about Western Europe and the radical right-wing parties who would very much like to take these countries on this trajectory? Are they stopped? What are the constraints on this, and what would enable them to move countries into patronal democracy or into an autocracy again?
Well, there is a difference between because in mainstream literature, these extreme right-wing parties are they are treated together with Orban and Kaczynski as populists and as right-wing, extreme right-wing populists. However, there is a huge difference between what we call an ideology-driven populist and an ideology-applying populist. So what we are talking about here is whether the actor's actual motivation is to be an extremist and to be anti-Semitic, and perhaps they can change their policies like Le Pen did in France. And but that was a long process. That was a long process of changing an ideological position. Whereas in Hungary, for example, the groups to be stigmatized, they are being replaced almost on a daily, or not on a daily, but on a weekly or monthly basis. So they are chosen. They basically choose the groups to stigmatize on the basis of how scary they are to the people, how many cleavages there are between them and the Hungarian population. And for example, liberal intellectuals, there was a short campaign against liberal intellectuals. There are not so many, they are not so scary. But if you think about, for example, migrants, with migrants, there are ethnic diversity, there is an ethnic cleavage, there is a language cleavage, there is a cleavage in terms of socioeconomic position, and there are many other different cleavages between them and us, if we think about this in this kind of framework. And so, therefore, when the migrants came, they immediately changed their previous target groups. Of previously they targeted Roma, homeless people, and the like, but they then shifted to migrants. So this is a much more flexible kind of thing. And going back to the question, because this is related to that. These ideologies, with an ideology applying populists, like populists in post-communist countries, they use ideology while their actual motives are power monopolization and accumulation of personal wealth. So they just use it as a camouflage. And but in fact, they want to put their country, as Bálint explained, on a route toward autocracy. Whereas populist parties in the West, which are extremists, they are driven, they are ideology driven in this sense. They are not using the ideology just as a camouflage, but they are trying to follow that kind of ideology, and they do not necessarily want to put their country on that road toward autocracy, although there are rhetorical points that they make about delegitimizing their opponents, but usually when they get to power, they very often moderate, and they don't try to change the institutional system in a way as patronal leaders do in post-communist countries.
If we want to make a difference between ideology-driven and ideology-applying regimes, then we say that ideology-driven ones has a value coherence, while in ideology applying, they have a functionality coherence. And it's a huge difference, because if you are an ideology-driven regime, then it's easy to see whether you are not only just, it is a value coherence, it has a value coherence, but whether the regime is ready to pay a political price for following certain values, even for us non-sympathetic values. For example, in Poland, the pro-life course against the abortion and campaigns, permanent campaigns, I think they just reduce the support of the Kaczynski's government. But in spite of this, that they are doing this, Orban would never do this. They always measure that what brings for them politically, and they follow them. So on one hand, they have an anti-migrant, anti-Muslim campaign, and even on the same day when they put out the posters against the migrants, he gives a speech for Muslim entrepreneurs in Hungary that we can learn a lot from the Islam and your culture, and you are rated here, when he can make personal businesses with them. Therefore, we make a difference between populism and, let us say, extremist ideologies. Because now, as populism is used, it has no border. And we say that populism, in our definition in the book, it means that it's an ideological instrument, so not an ideology, an ideological instrument for the political program of morally unconstrained collective egoism. And this is what's going, and populism in our treatment, we think that it's a legitimacy question. It's challenging the legal, rational legitimacy and wants to replace it with a substantive rational legitimacy. And this is the main aim. So when it's described that it's against the elites and in the favor of people, etc., etc., there's nothing else. Just when populism wants to destroy the whole institutional system of public deliberation, which is the skeleton, I would say, political skeleton of liberal democracies, and replace it with a leader who represents in person the will of the so-called people, but practically only his will for maximizing his personal power and profit.
That's, it brings up an interesting, first of all, this is the first time that I've heard Kaczynski described as anything other than utterly cynical. So I'm sure he'd appreciate your intervention. But secondly, the question here is if the goal is to move to a personalist regime that doesn't operate by formal rules, but by loyalty to the leader, why would these regimes invest so much in transforming the formal institutional frameworks, right? I mean, the first thing that Orban does when he gets to power in 2010 is to basically pass an entirely new constitution. So even though the goal is sort of, informality and personal loyalty, the strategy seems to be of transforming the formal institutional framework in a way that favors him.
Well, actually, actually there are exceptions to that. If we talk about, for example, Moldova, in Moldova, that's a very special case when the chief patron, Claudiu, became a chief patron, the informal leader of the informal patron network, without becoming a prime minister or a president. So he was just a member of parliament. And if you just looked at his former position, if you identified him by his former position, you would just not understand the system, because you would not see that informally he was actually someone who actually had on his payroll informally the constitutional judges and other members of parliament and a lot of other people. So he was the one who didn't change his general aim was not changing the former framework, but to operate it informally. So there is this kind of model. But usually this is not what happens. And actually Henry Hale, who wrote a wonderful book entitled Patronal Politics, he writes about the connection or the interrelation between formal and informal institutions. And for instance, one of the very important points is that when there is an election, and on an election that has a so-called focal effect or a signaling effect. It has an effect when the opposition parties and the opposition forces can organize against the rulers and the ruling elite. And basically, the problem is for the rulers is to make sure that it doesn't look like as if they can lose the election. So it basically, there is an election, but they have to make sure that the people actually are convinced that they cannot be replaced, because then it basically becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by changing the formal institutional framework, and that contributes to that to a great degree, because if if the constitutional framework was left intact, then there would be a greater chance, for example, in Hungary, that if they didn't change, there was a proportionate or rather disproportionate electoral system already before 2010, but they changed it. That's a former rule, but they had to change it so that they can make sure their re-election and their use of the state resources much more obvious. And so the people's perception was not that they can actually lose the election, but that the people's perception was that they are going to be re-elected. That is a key. That's this perception to the stability of these regimes.
And this brings us to our next question from one of the audience members, who asks about, well, why do people put up with this, right? I mean, all these regimes, whether Poland or Hungary, were voted in by minorities, not by 50+% of the voters, but by 40, 42, 38, and so on. And the same holds for President Trump here in the United States. This was not a majority winner. So why is there more of a shift in the popular vote? Are voters simply being strategic and recognize that this is an imperfect democracy and their side can't win? Or is there something else going on that doesn't sort of convince more voters to oppose this?
Well, when we are speaking about autocratic breakthrough, then I already mentioned that Orban even could unilaterally change the election law, which was made more disproportionate after it. And there are a lot of other measures what he could make just to cheat on the elections, not only in the classic terms, but other ways as well. Practically used state resources for the propaganda, invaded the media with force and blackmail. They bought up a large part of the private media and concentrated in the hands of their clients, etc. So all these things which create such a situation which is very close to that what we can see in Russia, for example, that we are very close to that you cannot win on elections, and even for example, if on the local elections Budapest was won by the opposition candidate and some other major cities as well. Then with the two-thirds majority in the parliament, they changed the constitution and changed the law, and they took away competencies and resources from these cities, which is another form of election fraud, namely that they do not respect the results of the election. They do not respect the popular will. But at the same time, they do not want to create an open dictatorship of autocracy. They need the facade that that legitimacy is based on a popular legitimacy, that they are elected on people. They only deteriorate the whole system, and they try to use it this way. But as we mentioned earlier already, that in so-called patronal democracies, none of the patron-client networks can get into the position that they could subordinate all other patron-client networks to themselves and create a monopoly of this power. This is what happened in Hungary, because as a result of the autocratic breakthrough, in the process of autocratic consolidation, what was finished and done. And you know, after the Second World War, practically in most part of the world, even the autocrats want to show that they have a popular legitimacy, and they manipulate that popular legitimacy. This is the problem of hybridology, that they see these popular facades. Of course, they have data, available data about parties, elections, etc., etc. The parties, political parties are not the same as in a Western society. The political actors are not the same as in a Western society. But when we speak about patronalism and different forms of patronalism, it's very difficult to create indicators with which you can measure that to what degree a society is patronal one, and it's not just deviancy, the corruption and all other things. This is what in the model we already showed that in a single pyramid patronal autocracy, to be corrupt is a necessary thing, that you could belong to the adopted political family. If you are not corrupt, then you cannot be a part of that criminal organization. You cannot be blackmailed. You cannot be detained if you are not loyal. So instead of the forms of physical force of disciplining the people in dictatorships, there are these patron-client networks and the networks of blackmailing people and forcing them for obedience and loyalty. This is how these systems are operated.
I'm afraid we've already run out of time, but thank you so much for a fantastic presentation and the wonderful conversation that we had with the Q&A. And to our audience members, please join us next week for another conversation, this time with Jean Beeman. So Bálint and Bum, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you very
It's
much.
been an honor.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.